want to talk about a couple of things, a couple of choice T words, one of them being trust, the other being truth. And the trust I'm talking about is the muscle, the trust in your inner knowing, in our inner knowing. So what is inner knowing? Well, there's a couple ways to take that apart and examine it. Inner knowing has different dimensions. I mean, there's information, ideas, and energy and knowing that we're born with. There's much that we have, on some level, purposely forgotten. So to learn to trust the inner knowing, we have to go through life. We have to unravel things. We have to evolve through our process and both remember what is fundamental and true about us and where we came from and what we're doing here, and also discover things along the way based on our experiences and what process we go through learning and the exposure we have through the mentors and family, etc., that helps develop our inner knowing. So to be able to trust that inner knowing is also another aspect of that, because it's something we build upon as we go through this life. So inner knowing is developed through experience and education. Experience would include ideas such as reading and study, training, and a lived experience, going through the ups and downs, learning, falling, failing, standing up, learning, falling, failing, going through the rigmarole of a normal human life. Through that becomes this patchwork of our understanding and develops into discernment and intuition, and of course inner knowing. So all the books that we read, I think, and I was thinking about this yesterday, listening to a few different people that I follow on YouTube and otherwise, and some of them are extremely well read. So they can speak about topics that they have ingested over decades at length and collate and synthesize ideas readily. And it's not that they're memorizing and have memorized these things, obviously, because that's impossible. Maybe not impossible, but improbable and difficult. And we're not machines, so there's really no point to memorize things like that. That's not knowing something, that's just information. So knowing something by reading a bunch of material, studying different materials, to me, creates these sort of anchor points. And I was having a chat with GPT about this morning. It put forth the idea of synaptic bridges, so that we can recall this information, which is in the field, that the ether that basically, is all pervasive and that we are inexorably a part of. That information field, call it Akashic Records, call it what you will. It's an information field, the source field that's all around us, that we can pull from what we want, what we need to know when we need to know it. And if we've gone through a whole bunch of material and studied over the years, we've created these little anchor points that allows us to pull certain information with a little more specificity and depth than someone else might, because we've accessed those ideas and opened up those portals perhaps to more easily retrieve that information later on. And again, it's not a memory, it's not in our brain, it's not something we memorized. It's simply everything that exists in the field, everything that any human has ever conceived of, written, produced, created. All of these ideas are out there. And when you look at something like AI, that's the artificial version of being able to access and pull from this field of all human knowledge specific ideas and information and data sets, etc. But when it's us, the organic human avatar machine that's pulling this information, it's a whole different process, right? It's comparable, certainly, because our brain is the encoder decoder of this field and this consciousness that we activate and access and utilize at any given moment. So that type of inner knowing, that type of pulling the information and decoding it based on our lived experience, based on our education and research, allows us to synthesize and collate ideas and then present something in a cohesive and comprehensive fashion that is of service to those who resonate with the ideas, who are seeking that kind of knowledge and information, who have indeed read some of the same materials and such. But it goes through, of course, our perception filters, right? It goes through our lived experience. It goes through our unique and individual expression, the language as we understand it, the syntax, the capacity for complexity and the language and words and level of intellect with which we are expressing these ideas. So regardless of what was studied and read and entertained over the years, it inevitably gets restructured, rewritten, recoded in a unique and individual way, coming through our ideas, through our intentions of what we are trying to get across, through our perception filters, as I mentioned. So to trust that inner knowing is simply a matter of experience and going through the motions hundreds, maybe thousands of times. So to find that voice, so to get beyond the performative and to actually be delivering something unrehearsed and unprepared, if that's the way we go about it. For me, I prefer to speak extemporaneously, kind of off the cuff, as it were, based on information I've taken in recently, which of course, inevitably brings forth ideas that have been accumulated over decades of this kind of research and exploration and experimentation and study. Similarly to when I write on my blog or otherwise, it's, after a week or two, depending if I'm doing it regularly, something that just pushes forth and emerges into my awareness that needs to be expressed. And more often than not, it seems to correlate and coincide with many others, perhaps in this similar process and similar vein of expression of ideas and thoughts. There seems to be, something in the field, as it were, that many of us speak about at the same time or within, a few days of each other. And that's great. It's affirming to know that, we're tapping into something that is emerging and that wants to be expressed. And then each of us, of course, has our own unique way of interpreting, reinterpreting, and then, of course, decoding the information that's coming from within and emerging that we put out there in the various ways that we do. So how do we trust that inner knowing? It's a muscle, like I was saying earlier. Through practice and through life experience, we just know. It's not something that you can consider logically or intellectually. It's a knowing. It's a spiritual thing. It's an energetic thing. It's an intuitive thing. And it's not that we're necessarily right and correct. And that's where truth comes in, which I'll talk about. But in that moment, based on who we are, where we've come from, and what we've, who it is that we've emerged as up to this point, that is what we know. And that is what we can trust. And then the more often that we express these things, the more often we put them out there, the more we process through these moments and ideas and emerging thought processes, the easier it becomes to trust that. And it's not an ego thing. It's just simply an energy thing. It's trusting the flow and trusting that inner knowing based on the fact that we love and we care and we want to help improve things. It's not a performative thing. It's not a necessarily need to deliver something. It's simply being in that moment, being in that resonant truth to allow these things to emerge in such a way that will be of benefit to whoever might come across it. These ideas, these impulses, these inspirations, they don't come to us and through us by accident. And the way in which we choose to express them and share them, we have so many ways nowadays. As I've started to do some videos now, because that felt just like a natural expression, an extension of what I was already doing otherwise. And it's a completely different process to writing, right? So however we choose to convey these things is what is right and true for us in that particular moment. And we can trust that simply because everything that led us up to this exact moment inspired and infused that moment with the right kind of energy to catalyze these thoughts, to synthesize these impressions and impulses into something that someone out there might benefit from. And so we share it. Now, when it comes to truth, that is quite a loaded idea, isn't it? There's many different layers, many different dimensions to truth. And what's true for us today may not be true for us tomorrow. And that's the individual truth. There's personal truth, which is kind of a sense thing, family truth, or community truth, which is kind of inherited and inculcated through our environment, where we were born, the family we were born into, the belief structures and paradigm that whole framework generates and maintains for us. And then beyond that, of course, there's sociocultural truths, which are kind of these shared narratives throughout culture and a society, probably within a nation. And then, of course, there's geopolitical, which is just an extension of the same thing, another version of a shared truth. And then, of course, there are what you could say universal truths, absolute truths, maybe even laws, but that's kind of a blurry area to go into, because I think a lot of the laws that we live by are suspect and incomplete and should be interrogated properly before we simply adopt them and live by them. Because a lot of these truths based on, science is nonsense when you scrutinize them with an open mind and an open heart and really just examine what it is that you accept as a fundamental truth of your reality, and why do you choose to live in that way without ever questioning it. But that's a deeper topic. So for personal truth, that's part of this inner knowing process, and that's something with us every waking moment, and probably even in our dreams and beyond, the physical, of course. It's that constant through line, that storyline that walks with us in our thoughts, and that we wrestle with in every moment, that we struggle with and try to discern what is fact from fiction. And it's just this constant process of refinement and revising, improvement and interrogation. We are constantly on that road of not necessarily self-improvement, but an acknowledgement and some sort of a deeper revealing and emergence that requires that critical thinking. So through this process of consistent personal refinement and getting to better know and understand ourselves, of course, we develop that trust, that muscle of inner knowing. And that only comes through discerning what is authentic, real, and true along our life's path. And ultimately, regardless of the greater truths, regardless of, the zeitgeist and the civilizational narrative, societal narratives, it ultimately comes down to us, the unique individual, and our expression and what we live with as our living truth in our own personal mythology and our own story, and what we value most and prioritize in this life. And that is not necessarily an easy process, because when we're young, we completely trust and believe in those around us, be it our parents or guardians or otherwise. We have no reason to believe otherwise, generally, because why would they lie? And it's not so much that they're lying, it's just that based on their life, their experience, their education and exposure to ideas, their personal interrogation, their personal process of refinement, and everything that led them to where they are now in their lives, and to be able to convey their ideas and to teach and provide information and guidance and to protect you, whatever it might be. They only are aware of what they are aware of and what they're allowing to be emergent in their process and what they're allowing to be real and true. And they also, of course, like all of us, will have to contend with boundaries and limitations and the parameters of our accepted reality, unless we are actively pursuing open-mindedness and curiosity and wonder and mystery. Many people won't bother because they get bogged down and tied up with whatever it might be, responsibilities, especially if their circumstance, depending on what's required to provide for you as when you are a child. And which brings up another topic of, real presence and real parentage. It's one thing to provide sustenance and the basics. It's another to actually provide presence and the other non-physical types of nourishment. And so we have these two main foundational ideas of trust and truth. Trusting our inner knowing can only come through a whole bunch of discerning, learning, unlearning, refining truth. And we have to go from the grand scheme to the great story, down, 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 through the shared narratives, which can be very influential and toxic because those are, manipulated en masse at large scale through the media and the mainstream. And then we have, of course, family truth, the inherited beliefs that we have to contend with and keep them or throw them away. That becomes a personal choice at some point on the road to our personal development and self-actualization. It all comes back to personal truth, because ultimately that's the only one that, lives within us, within our hearts and our minds, within our energetic field. So to develop the trust in the inner knowing is a process of going through these levels of truths, ultimately bringing it back home to the individual personal truth. We have the universal truths, which you'll have to scrutinize and discern for yourself. What makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what's real, what's not. And those might never be entirely clear, but I think it's important to distinguish between what's simply a consensus repeated idea that became a truth, as opposed to something that's simply beyond opinion and something you can verify for yourself. It's like, that is true. Then, of course, cultural narratives, cultural truths, same idea. It's just shared narratives that are manipulated and constructed, and again, based on some sort of consensus, which is most often weaponized against any given society or culture. And what we see beyond culture, of course, when you think of government and how those things are generally dysfunctional, it's downstream from culture. So whatever creates the culture, creates that social shared narrative, ultimately reduces to governance and policymaking. So if you're frustrated with the nonsense that is government, then you have to consider a few steps before that. What created the culture in the society that then filtered down into that mechanism of codifying and lawmaking? Same idea. You'll have to interrogate these ideas, scrutinize what is accepted as truth, and discover for yourself what is true from what is simply noise. And that's another thing that will change, likely, through life. It certainly changed for me. Things that I used to believe and certainly don't make sense anymore, based on the accumulated knowledge, the lived experience, and discerning from information offered from others who have put in the hours, put in the research, and then, of course, deciding whether or not they can be trustworthy. Bringing it back to family and those that are generally closest to us and their truth and what we inherited from that experience and that environment, that can be some of the, as we go down these levels, of course, we can see that there's a density and a contrast and a conflict inside of us, because these get more and more personal as we're bringing it down, spiraling down to the individual, which is us. So for the familial and communal, inherited kind of beliefs, these can be the most difficult to contend with, because they're generally the ones we were most exposed to, obviously, during our formative years, and the ones that can be most hardwired within us, and the ones that we kind of inherently trust, right? There's that inner knowing. We trust it because it's simply most familiar, based on familial inherited beliefs and paradigms. So to challenge these and to break away from that, if necessary, can be probably some of the most difficult to contend with in our process, in our journey toward trusting that inner knowing and refining, as I was saying, rewriting our story. I'd say most will probably not want to go through that process, just because it's complexity and level of difficulty, and because it's much safer and much more secure to have that sort of support structure And if you were to alienate yourself or be ostracized from it, you become increasingly, isolated and separated from these things that you've known for your whole life. So, that's certainly part of the self-actualization and self-realization process and coming into our own in adulthood and through these initiations and such. So it's certainly a necessary part of the process, but don't think it's going to be an easy one. And then, of course, this all comes right back down and reduces to you, the individual, and your own personal trust in your inner knowing. And this whole process that'll evolve over years to unravel as to your truth, your story, your inner knowing is a very personal journey in the end. And as I said, what's true today may not be true tomorrow. And you have to be accepting of that paradox and the uncertainty of it, and to be open to not necessarily throwing it all away, but starting over many times in this one short life. And as it is with all of these things that are fundamental to our foundation, fundamental to living our best life and living fully into who we are, what we are, it's a matter of practice. An unavoidable one, simply because it is so important and so central to our identity and how we walk through this life and how we are going to perceive things that are offered to us, and our perspective on things both large and small, personal and societal, even civilizational, if we want to look at that grander scope, how we interrelate with friends, family, co-workers, and potential clients and such in our businesses, and how we're going to contend with the impositions and assaults that come at us from the mechanisms of the world that we live in, one of industry and commerce and artifice and perpetual conflicts and such. It's a world of contrast and polarity, and developing that inner knowing and then trusting that inner knowing is critical in that process, because we're going to be offered all manner of truths, different level of truths, and we're going to want to try them out, see if they fit. And we're going to, get frustrated time and time again if we attach too strongly to any one thing, to any one ideal, to any one finality or conclusion. It's a process, right? And the less we are attached to any of these things, the less we need to control everything, and the more we can realize that ultimately there is nothing that can stick to us, and there's very little, if anything, that we can control, then we'll have that openness and that curiosity and willingness to engage the mystery. And then we can adopt cleaner and clearer and more refined ideas into our inner knowing, and we will fine-tune and retune and attune this encoder-decoder that we're born with to better interpret ideas and to better integrate and to, if we're moved, to share them and to teach and to mentor others with. That's going to require presence and patience and, of course, persistence. Trust and truth. Two big T words of the day. Do you trust yourself? And is it true? So the ultimate goal with trusting that inner knowing is that process of unraveling, and as we get better at discerning and appreciating and implementing our intuitive process, we'll get better at addressing things that I've already spoken about in previous videos. We'll get better understanding how to live on purpose, how to discern our purpose. We'll get better at understanding and seeing through the tricks and the traps and the manufactured crises that dominate our shared narrative, this shared truth I was speaking of. We'll get better at meeting people where they are when we're talking about complex things and things that we've learned about and want to convey and want to, inform and perhaps awaken someone to the truth of. At the same time, we'll understand that just as we had to go through that process and unraveling ourselves, we might be able to better discern where they are at and what they might even be ready to hear, because you can't just pull the rug out from someone and assume that they're going to be able to stand on their own 2 feet with a completely new paradigm and belief system, right? And then, of course, we will appreciate and understand, as we've gone all through this adventure and experience and experimentation and interrogation of our life and our personal narrative, that change is life. It is a fundamental thing about life that we cannot avoid, and we have to simply embrace. It's the part of that paradoxical existence. It's this and that, not just this is true now and that's it. Well, no, it's not, right? Because that could change. You're going to change. The world is going to change. Everything is going to change, and changes life. And then, in a grander sense, we'll appreciate how this whole shared narrative of good versus evil, and why it might seem that evil gets a free pass in this world. We'll understand more of the truth to that, the grander perspective of that, and why many people might perceive that life's out to get them when nothing could be further from the truth.
It's the midday flower enveloping the sun.